Today is Sunday, August 1st. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor. This is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted, as always, to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition, and we are 100% listener supported. So if you like what we do and you want to support the show, head to patreon.com/noeasyanswers and click the subscribe button. Every little bit helps, and your contributions go towards furthering all the research, writing, and producing of each episode. And some of your contributions also go towards keeping the lights on, keeping my veins filled with coffee. And in exchange, you do receive some bonus content and some of our interviews in advance before we post to the main feed. You can also support us by leaving a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts, maybe leaving a few positive words in a review. Every time you leave a review, it sets the algorithms in motion, and that's how new listeners find the show. You can also follow us on Twitter, join us on our Discord server. You can send us a voice message, you can comment on our Reddit or YouTube page, and as always, we include links to all of those various ways you can interact with the podcast in the show notes. Also, we might do like a once-a-month live stream, maybe a Q&A session for listeners, maybe a live interview with some special guests. I'm not really sure, but, I got this new camera, I've got some new software, and I do want to interact with listeners a bit more. So drop us a line or reach out to us if you think this is a good idea, or if you'd want to participate. The Twitter DMs for the podcast are always open. And of course, if you want to email us, we welcome your comments, concerns, criticisms, and vitriol at noeasyanswerspodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so today's episode is a crossover episode featuring the host of one of my favorite podcasts, Acid Horizon. This isn't the first crossover episode we've done with the boys over at Acid Horizon, but maybe it's the first official crossover episode. Listeners will recall that in episode 32, where we discussed Carl Schmitt, our guest Matthew Lowry is also a co-host of Acid Horizon, and today we have with us Craig, the main host of Acid Horizon. I've wanted to speak with Craig for a long time, and as it turns out, I've been listening to theory discussions with Craig for longer than Acid Horizon has been a thing. During the first few weeks of the pandemic, I picked up a copy of a book called Anti-Oedipus by Gilles Deleuze and Deleuze Guattari. And Deleuze and Guattari, they're a bit difficult to figure out. Back in episode 16, Todd May, professor of philosophy at Clemson University, said that Deleuze is, without a doubt, one of the most obscurant authors in continental philosophy. So in my first encounter with Deleuze, I didn't really understand much of what I was reading. So I did what I normally do when I can't figure out a text. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos. I listened to Stephen West's Philosophize This episodes. And very quickly I found that in order to understand Anti-Oedipus, you have to understand a handful of philosophers that laid the groundwork for his thought. So Todd May also wrote an introduction book to Deleuze in which he cites a trinity of philosophers one must have a grasp of as a starting point, those philosophers being Henri Bergson, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Baruch de Spinoza. And so there I was, attempting to understand Henri Bergson's concept of time, Spinoza's challenge to the mind-body dualism of René Descartes, and Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead, and how all of that could ultimately enable me to understand what the fuck Gilles Deleuze and Deleuze Guattari were saying. But what helped me out the most, out of these various resources I found, was something called the Deleuze Guattari Quarantine Collective, which is an ongoing reading group held over Discord. As it turns out, Craig was the main voice in that reading group. And so for a while, I had been listening to Acid Horizon and thinking to myself, man, Acid Horizon should do a crossover with the Deleuze Guattari Quarantine Collection. Without spoiling too much of this conversation, it wasn't until speaking to Craig in this conversation that I found out that he was actually the guy from the Quarantine Collective. So Also, in a few days, we'll be releasing part 2 of this crossover episode. Listeners might recall that in episode 19 featuring Daniel Barker, that's not his real name, but Daniel is a psychoanalyst, and so he keeps his podcast appearances anonymous. But Daniel Barker was recently a guest on Acid Horizon, and he's become a friend of their podcast. So in part 2, we'll be joined by both Craig and Daniel. Also, I'm going to send a message to Will, one of the other co-hosts of Acid Horizon, and I'm going to have him on the show soon to speak about Michel Foucault. I think the boys over at Acid Horizon might be having me on their pod soon, so, this is kind of a love fest in a way. A couple friends just shooting the shit, talking about music and philosophy, and I think listeners of this show will enjoy these conversations, and I think listeners would enjoy the content over at the Acid Horizon podcast, so be sure to check them out wherever you receive your podcasts. Links to their podcast and Twitter are in the show notes. So here's my conversation with Craig from the Acid Horizon podcast. Fucking A. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, so I came in here with just the idea that, like, all right, you're going to ask me a bunch of questions about music, and I'm just going to bat them back like a cat batting back a tennis ball or something. So I don't,
okay, yeah.
Whatever you want to talk about, I'm into. I can do music. I can do some philosophy. We can do a mixture. I'm ready.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you, as I've already said I'm a fan of your podcast. It's why we're doing this, but I also, in listening to your podcast, I as just in being a listener of podcasts, my brain always has this background operation of like, what is this discourse or stuff telling me about this host as a person?
Oh, okay. Interesting.
You know what I'm saying, right? So, so like, as I've gone through and listened to your stuff, how old is your podcast, by the way?
Just over a year old. So we started it during the pandemic.
Right.
Maybe you're aware of the story somewhat. So, here we were all there. What was it, March or March of
right
2020. And at that time, and maybe you know this from listening to the podcast, I was teaching in the LA County men's jail system. I'm currently no longer doing that, although I'm doing a teaching assignment that's associated with the same organization. There's no telling when education is going to come back to the jail system or the prison system in the sort of robust way that folks had been experiencing it. But so basically my job as a teacher, because I was teaching in the jail system, there's really no way for me to reach any of those students. The population turns over very quickly there. It was like the brakes were slammed on it. But since, here in California, the teachers union here is very strong. They protect the rights of workers here in a way, that a lot of other teachers across the United States, are very envious of. So I was able to keep my job throughout the pandemic. I was actually still doing work. I was building online classes and attending meetings and things like that. But, I had an abundance of free time as well. So one of the things that I got to doing right away was, I'd like to share in a philosophical experience with people online. Everybody's home, so let's do it. So we started this Anti-Oedipus reading group online through a server on Discord that was called the Deleuze Guattari Quarantine Collective. We were doing that, and maybe you've popped in there. I'm not sure.
I will tell you, man, that I when I first, because like you, I had a lot of time during the pandemic and stuff, and I picked up Deleuze and I was like surfing through podcasts about Deleuze and found the D&G Quarantine Collective and listened to it, but I think I was already familiar with Acid Horizon, but I was like, that sounds like Craig, And so it was one of the questions I wanted to ask you is like, were you a part of the D&G Quarantine Collective? Because I don't know, I made that connection and I just wanted verification of it, but that's really cool, man.
That's actually what happened. I put out the feelers on Reddit, and then there was someone who reached out to me and, to help organize it. And it wasn't long before a whole bunch of people sort of piled on. including Will and Matt, who you had on your show recently. And we started doing weekly readings. And then in addition to that, we were doing these sort of ancillary recordings. Some of them were on the work of Mark Fisher and so forth. And prior to that, as a teacher, my commute here in LA was about 1 hour in either direction, sometimes an hour and 10 or an hour and 30 minutes, depending on how traffic is here. Right. So I'm listening to podcasts, and, being an avid consumer of that kind of media, I've heard all kinds of things. And, it was the kind of thing where I'm like, well, if I ever do this, it's going to be like this. It's going to be like this. It's going to have this kind of music. But I did not have the time. In fact, during that time too, like my weekends are taken up because I'm playing music in some cover bands and doing my own thing as well, right? And all that's done during the pandemic too. So, in the course of developing that server, in the course of developing that space, it occurred to me that, well, actually, what I really want to do is get this podcast going. And so, I'd gotten to know Will, I'd gotten to know Matt, and there was somebody else on there who I really wanted to have join us. They didn't work out in the end, and that was really because they had other things going on. But then we soon found Adam after that, and things got rolling pretty quickly. Given the circumstances, none of us had a whole lot to do, especially if we're involved with academics or that sort of thing.
Right.
And so here I am sitting at home. I got great recording equipment. I got music. I've been sitting on ambient music that I've made for years. It's awesome. Like I'm gonna mobilize this.
Yes.
and I had just finished my grad program maybe about 6 months prior in philosophy, and I was like, and I'm gonna mobilize that too. And so some of the incipient episodes were, of course, on Deleuze and Foucault, and it still continues to be the case. But that was a way to sort of get things off the ground. And over the course of 3 months, 6 months, and here we are now, a year and change, things have been moving along swimmingly. And we've just passed 100,000 downloads. And I think our Twitter following is fairly modest. But to be honest with you, I actually don't want it to grow anymore. I'd like to just keep the cadre of folks that we have right now, because people DM me, and I'm just the kind of person, I'm too nice. I got to get back to everybody.
Yeah.
And so, and that's the way that I like to play it. I don't like to make enemies. There's a political dimension to what we do, of course, a very political dimension, but I try to keep it as nonpartisan as possible. Basically one of my original intents was I want to create a space for thinking that's sort of cut off or insulated from a lot of the sort of commercialization, or at least the themes surrounding politics and punditry and even philosophy somewhat, that have either been monetized or commercialized or, been used in the, in clout grabs, I guess you would say. And, I wanted to have like a very sort of serious, like when you turn on our podcast, in that hour space, like it was going to be dense, right? It still kind of is, right? So that you could go back and listen to it and utilize it. And you can probably hear my edits are pretty tight. And I do that because my goal, or my philosophy is that I want this to leave a legacy that, 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, anybody can go back to any one of these episodes and said, you know what, this is what really helped me out, or this is what got me into that thinker. And so that was the plan. And it seems to be going fairly well, at least to my satisfaction, and everybody who's expressed, interest and enjoyment with what we're doing.
Man, I feel like when I turn on your podcast, I'm going on a trip, and and I can trust where you guys are going to take the conversation and the discourse in a lot of ways that make the podcast something, one of my favorites and near the top, is because I trust that your engagement is like part of, like, I guess what Todd May called upright thought, or some philosopher, like how it's like you have the sincerity to seek to know, You are asking questions in good faith with like a sort of good faith intention of what the result will be. Like you're searching for capital T truth in a way,
Right.
not to take that to its furthest weight there, but you're engaging with these texts and these authors, and you're examining kind of who the philosopher was, what did they say, what are the implications of these statements, and how is this useful to our times, I suppose. So a lot of that is really wonderful, and I try to do similar, in a roundabout way, try to do similar things with my podcast, because I am too concerned about like leaving a legacy. When these episodes are, they're committed to the digital ether out there, but people will listen to them, and I hope they can reference them and take them with them. And one thing I've said is I want the listener to be able to take from our episodes something that hopefully enhances their way of being in the world.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I feel like, your podcast has a very similar vibe and mission and mindset when it comes to all this stuff. And the music obviously helps like kind of set the course for that journey as you are turning this podcast on and you're listening to these engagements. And sometimes y'all go to really trippy places, man. But I wonder if you've noticed this within kind of the podcast community that are out there, like so a lot of these podcasts that are philosophical or political, mostly leftist. I'm not listening to anything else, anything on the right. But like, did you notice there was like a movement to where like everyone started talking about spirituality lately? And I noticed you guys jumped on that too, which I really enjoyed that episode with you guys. But did you notice that sort of thing happening?
I saw, there are specific podcasts that,
and we don't have to mention names or whatever. I'm not trying to call anybody out, but yeah.
I can think of one or two podcasts that had a similar episode. The particular episode that we did on the case for a materialist spirituality, that was something that we were sort of asked to do in a way, not to say that we weren't responsible for making the choice to cover what it is that we chose to cover. But, this is one of, I won't say that it's symptomatic, but it's certainly derivative of the focus and interest that's been placed on somebody like Mark Fisher, for example. I think when you delve into Deleuze and Guattari to a certain extent, like if you're reading Anti-Oedipus, one of the initial challenges that they bring up in the text is, how is it that, take Marxism, for instance, and, the notion of a vulgar Marxism where you have the material conditions of, society, the economy, what have you, maturing to a certain point where the contradictions explode and release that revolutionary energy, and everybody ousts their bosses and workers take control and all is right with the world. Deleuze and Guattari, and among others, of course, noted, well, that's not quite happened in some cases. In fact, things went awry. And, using the work of Wilhelm Reich and others, this is a question that we've decided to take very seriously. And I think there's a way in which Mark Fisher more or less picks up the same question when he asks, for example, what is it that we need to do to, raise a sort of class consciousness in a time where it seems as if that moment has passed us by? That's kind of the simple way to put it. Another way that Mark Fisher looks at it is like, in what ways are we living within capitalist society? What are the institutions that we choose to participate in that seem to suggest that we have this sort of leftover, latent desire for communism? His example in the essay Post-Capitalist Desire is the paradigmatic one, the Starbucks. Like, why is it that people go to Starbucks, open up their laptop, they commune together? It's a space in which work and play, rest, relaxation, and leisure are kind of in this, sort of miasmic mixture, everyone kind of interacting together. It seems to suggest for Fisher that there is something about that space and the activity that occurs there that capitalism has been able to capture, but seems communal nonetheless. right? So, and, like, I mean, the sort of like crass, question is like, all right, well, how can we rescue that so we don't have to pay $5 for a drink every time? How can how can we create that space, And I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I love coffee shops too. And, part of the commodity purchase is part of the ensemble of those experiences. And sometimes it's hard to imagine. Imagine just walking into a space, just pulling up and like, oh yeah, here's your drink, Craig. And then like, imagine not paying. And then you're just kind of sitting with other people. Like that would be kind of weird because this is kind of a weird use of the term, but we've fetishized the activity of payment, right?
Sure.
As a way to participate in those kinds of spaces. But anyway, I'm kind of zeroing in on that example because I think it's, like I said, a paradigmatic one. And then from there, a lot of the discussions that we have created around ideology, desiring production, involve similar topics.
Right. Well, I especially enjoyed your conversation around a materialist spirituality in that more recent episode you did. Just because, I on the podcast lately, I've been examining some aspects of spirituality and mostly like I got very concerned about Umberto Eco's text of We're Fascism, and the very first thing he lists is syncretism, which to me, I don't know that I really understood why that was listed as the first thing until I started understanding that like there's more and more people identifying as spiritual but not religious and kind of in a syncretistic sort of way adopting different notions from different religions. But being really ignorant to like the entry point of like meditation and mindfulness and stuff into the, vernacular. Like that's, nobody knows where that stuff came from, but everyone's like, oh yeah, namaste or something, or, oh yeah, we do yoga, or you need to meditate, and it's just, to me, I've always been very, anyway, the point is that the materialist spirituality thing that was discussed was really interesting to me because I feel like there's a real danger in not keeping any sort of results or impact or ground level empirical substantive aim of discussions if they go off to this place in the clouds, like if things sort of transcend into this talk of a spirituality that is immaterial, that is ethereal, that is not tangible, that is then maybe the good that could be done through our aims in these things, if it's not sufficiently grounded in a materialist aspect, it just kind of gets lost in the clouds a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, how to answer that? I would say the one argument, or the how would I develop a line of argument for that? I think there's a desire within us as individuals or collectively to experience repose. Right? To have a kind of experience where we are cut off from all of the connections which are imposed upon us, right? Capitalism does produce those kinds of experiences, but does so often under the caveat that you either have to pay for them or that, they are captured, under some notion of business ontology, right? In the sense of like, hey, here's a quick book, like here's 15-minute mindfulness tricks that you can use to get your day back going. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. Yeah. But, what about just not fucking working? right? You know what I mean? Like, what about taking 3 months off? What about just not working for a year?
I thought at times that could be the most radical thing you could do is just not work.
Just not work.
The great refusal or something,
Something like that, right? I mean, there's a kind of a naive way that we can approach this in the sense that, like, look, under current circumstances, that it might not seem feasible, but why not? Like why can't the commune exist today in some way, shape, or form? And I look at myself, I'm in my 40s, right? And I've lived a life of, I've been to school a few times, 2 master's degrees. I've worked quite a bit, pension plan coming, the whole thing. Like, I'm totally in the system, right? I'm invested. And,
Right.
from the standpoint of becoming an older man at some point, it's a scary prospect to think that the work that you put in will not be returned to you in the form of security or comfort when it matters most. Right. And so, and this is, I think, one of the challenges to the idea of creating the commune under capitalism as we have it now, because, we can do so through a kind of adventurism, right? We can do so through squatting and things like that. But, the question is, how sustainable is that over time? It would really take like a mass movement of people to do that, like just a massive polycule of people interacting, various communes, right?
Yeah.
And so, the question is, like for somebody like myself, is like, am I willing to wager it all, in a singular revolution? It's like, okay, now I lose my pension, I lose all this stuff, and maybe that's what it takes, like, who knows? Like I'm still open. I'm still open to the prospect, even being an older person, like our environment and the world that we live in is already compromised. I mean, even in this week, just seeing the massive environmental cataclysms that we're suffering, how is it that we're going to, we have this idea of moving forward, but I mean, clearly there is a kind of forward movement that's an impediment to the prospect of living 10 to 20 to 30 years from now, right? Like something needs to give now. And, and who cares about my pension at the end of the day if it means the survival of the species, right? Right. So there's that part of me too. And so, I mean, just to kind of bring it all back, these are the kinds of things that are on my mind as I'm, an older person, doing a podcast like this and dealing with younger people. One of the benefits that I've yielded from it has really revitalized that sort of plastic, youthful aspect of myself where I'm not getting settled in the same way as other peers who are my age are, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the sort of wonderful benefits of immersing myself in the discourse and creating the podcast and doing all these sorts of things. It's life. It's giving me life. So for that very reason, I want to continue to do this. But anyway, that was a very sort of like a meandering response to your initial question. But maybe in some ways that little serpentine crosses all the right thresholds.
Yeah, I think your podcast starts out by saying something like the specter of a world that could be free.
Yeah, that's Marcuse. Yeah,
it's Marcuse, right? And so, so the specter of a world that could be free. I mean, it's kind of just a lovely way to enter any sort of discourse in a way, because it's kind of like I guess what I'm saying is that a world that could be free, man. I mean, the sort of commune that you're speaking of requires a sort of radical train of thought to rethink the order and rethink the way things are fundamentally pieced together. That's what a revolution does, right? It's like it's a disruption that and ultimately after the revolution things are reconstituted in another fashion. So the specter of a world that could be free and the sort of concept of a commune, I mean, the part of getting to that, the willingness to be radical or the willingness to think radically or the willingness to disrupt any given order that your feet are planted on in general, right? I know that personally what got me there, or part of a big reason I would say that got me there, there was a lot of, obviously like the socialist thing, the Bernie, and then the Bernie to DSA to not being a fucking liberal pipeline sort of thing. All that stuff exists, right? But honestly, it was through a sort of what I've called in the past a profound relationship with reality, in that like understanding that not only am I atheistic, I'm an atheist, and I also try to rid myself of any supernatural beliefs, and some of those things are ingrained in us more than others. Like sometimes you're a grown ass man and you think you saw a ghost or something, or like something,
Right.
shit like that happens, right? So you just try and pull all that out of my head, and part of that also was, in the temporality of life and truly reckoning with the weight of what the implications of that is. Like, all right, so for me, there's no heaven, there's no hell, so there's no punishment, there's no family reunion, there's none of that stuff, and life is temporal, and we are here in this world. And this is the only time we have, and the urgency of those of that line of thought, and the sort of, maybe it's a little Heidegger of like always being shadowed by death, like that to me drove me to have the willingness to think radically, to have the willingness to aid in a disruption or to forward a revolution, and so a specter of a world that could be free, man. It seems like that statement is really important to you. I mean, is it? Can you maybe talk about the significance of that statement and why you chose to place it at the front?
Well, I actually kind of like some of the sort of anecdote that you shared just a moment ago here, which is this idea that at any given moment there can be this kind of radical rupture. Maybe it occurs to us in a phenomenological way, like the whole symbolic order is shattered in a moment. We see something and it's an immediate awakening, like Satori in Zen, for example.
Yeah.
I would say rarely, this wasn't the case for me, and I don't think it's typically the case for a lot of other people, but it's not like my position ever moved slowly. I want to say that there was a kind of radical shift. There are some very pronounced moments in my own life where I did have radical shift. So one of them was, a long time ago. I was living in Japan. This was in the early aughts. And I was just standing in my apartment, just totally random. And I reflected on a conversation that I had with my brother in our teens. That must have been like 5 or 6 years, maybe even 7 years prior to this instance, where he talked about protecting the borders of the United States from illegal immigrants, right? And how it was like, and he at the time, he's a lot more liberal and progressive minded now, but we grew up in a very conservative environment. And one of the things that he said was, he's like, well, at some point, we're just going to have to start shooting them, right? And for some reason, that just stuck with me, right? And I didn't really battle back in that moment. But that conversation just kind of circulated in my subconscious for years. And then I remember one day I had just recalled the conversation, and another thought adjacent to it, almost completely different in some aspect, occurred to me, which was, why can't people, and it was articulated almost exactly like this, why can't people who live in a certain place, no matter where they live, just own and manage the resources in their locality, right? And it just occurred to me all of a sudden. And I had been in philosophy, I didn't study Marxism in college. In fact, or at least as an undergrad, I should say, as a graduate student, I did. But as an undergrad in the late 90s, it was a little bit uncommon. There were other things happening in the world of philosophy that at that time that were foregrounded in philosophy departments. Hence one of the reasons I didn't see these things. So maybe we could chalk that up to being a kind of repressed thought in either my individual or collective subconscious, where this idea of why can't I be the owner of that which is around me, right? And granted, there is a sort of naive take on this. If I think I even needed to digest that thought even more, and develop it into something more sophisticated that, had, just more robust contours politically, for lack of a better term. So, I remember that moment, and that moment kind of stuck with me. And what was interesting was I was living in Japan at the time, and I don't know if you have been to Japan or experienced that culture, but they move. First of all, their governments provide much more money for, education, for public transportation. Things move a little bit more smoothly in that regard. It seems like public services are a little bit more robustly funded. As a society, at least on the surface, things seem to move a little bit more smoothly. I mean, there's a way in which I'm kind of idealizing the other of that culture, even as a young man who had been there for a while. But then after coming back to the United States and seeing how that wasn't the case, and actually being quite a poor person, like I was living like at a middle-class income at a very young age while I was in Japan. And then for 10 years, I struggled in Los Angeles. My rent increased exponentially, and it was like, a wake-up call, as they say. And not to mention, there was a kind of culture shock associated with it. So that was like another sort of like radical move, right? And then there were other things. And then one of them was I had cancer. I had a tumor that was growing out of a birthmark on my scalp. And this was at a time in my life where, I'm doing bands and stuff. And, I'm also, working the shit job. I'm working in a call center for a bank right at this time, just making it, just getting by, doing the car payment, doing everything else. Had just broken up with my girlfriend, kind of going through those cycles that you go through in your 20s and 30s. And then, that there was, death knocking on my door. And it wasn't the sort of existential shock per se, but it was seeing our system in light of that existential shock. The fact that I was using, for like being a full-time employee, I couldn't access my benefits for this because there was some like weird paperwork thing involved, because the diagnosis, or like I didn't go, I'm on an HMO program and I didn't go to the right, what is it? Primary care provider or something like that. And also at that time I had been sick, like I had like a flu or something, and it's probably because of the fact that I had cancer, right? And I'm getting scolded at work, like, hey, if you take another sick day, you're going to get written up. Okay, there's your write-up. Next time you could be terminated. And I'm trying to get back into school at the time. And so there's a lot of friction there. Right. And so, that sort of, that ensemble of just chaos, right? Like led me to think like, what is happening here? Like this isn't right. And so basically I took out a student loan to pay for my operation, which at that time, there were two possible operations that I could receive. I opted for the cheaper one on wagering, based on what the surgeon had said. He's like, it's probably going to work. So I did that. Wow. And also negotiating a cheaper price for the surgery, and him just doing me a solid and saying, okay, I'm going to knock off the charges for this. I'm going to knock off the charges for, you know what I mean? It's like, wow. It was like buying a car. Yeah. And, it was just at that moment, I said to myself, you know what, like, I don't know if I can stop this machine, but I hate this machine. I don't want to do this anymore. Right. And so, at that time, I had done things like join political parties that were somewhat radical, started working with them and so forth, and, did some work there and whatnot. But the rest is kind of history in a way, I guess you would say. Sure. And since then, there have been like little ebbs and flows. I mean, like anybody who's been involved with radical politics feels burnout now and again, or maybe has, some sobering moments along the way, and and often, and like, let's face it, you see some protests, or, you get involved in some groups and some ugly things happen, sometimes very human things. Yeah. And, it's the sort of thing that doesn't mean that, the things that we're fighting for are somehow invalidated because of that. But, it's tough, like that sort of activist burnout feeling that you get. I was doing that for a lot. I was doing like counter recruitment stuff, creating counter recruitment materials, and trying to do those things for schools. And there's some people in the party working hard, other people not working so hard. It's frustrating, know?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for like sharing all that with me, man. Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate you, at least talking about the I mean, what an awful thing to go through. I mean, negotiating like a student loan to pay for a surgery and haggling over that. I mean, Christ, man. Like, and that's kind of, it seems like this is just sort of the common logic of our society. And these experiences are just, they happen every day in a way. So it's like, whereas like I'm sitting here thanking you for telling me this, but I also
Mhm.
understand that these are, it's probably not exceptional in the story, in that this happens to a lot of people.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
know,
Yeah.
and so part of what's difficult to hold in my mind is like the singularity of personhood with the sort of mass scale of knowing that this is just how society operates,
Right. Yeah.
and you think to like, I don't know, people that are irreplaceable to you, and how are they are in no way treated as the irreplaceable that they are by our
Mhm.
society, by our bosses, by the managerial class more broadly, by the institutions, and how they're regarded by our elected leaders.
Mm.
So it's the injustices of the world, man. It's like, I'm a songwriter, man. Musically, like that's what I identify as first and
Right.
foremost. That's why everything that I've ever done in music has come from wanting to be a songwriter,
Mm.
so I say that because uh, during this journey of radicalization and having this sort of realization that Jesus Christ, everybody's suffering around me. And so if you get off of this kick of like positivity and counting your blessings for a second, and positive vibes only, bro, like,
Right.
like get high and hang out and be a musician and not have a care in the world. At a certain point, my eyes opened up a little bit, and as a songwriter, always trying to search for, uh, greater substantive lyrics in some way. I was a little disappointed in myself having come to that realization a little late
Mm.
in life, in my late 20s. But I was like, dude, why don't you watch the news and see if you can kind of tune in to a sort of, uh, I guess, tune into the sufferings of the world, is how I kind of looked at it, is like reckon
Right.
with what is happening right now in the world around you, that could feasibly, you could go your entire life and just live your life with one foot in front of the other and not recognize.
Hmm.
And so as soon as I started to tune into that stuff is really when I started to understand, like, the singular sort of personhood of like a thing that happens to a buddy of yours that's unfortunate, that sucks, that could have been prevented, that is all these awful things. Uh, why don't we look at and see the singularity of personhood on the actual knowledge that like this happens every day, and this is just the sort of cultural logic.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like in a way what you're talking about is the kind of alienation that we experience, and the idea that it's one of those things that once it happens to you, or it happens to somebody who's close to you, you have that realization that the impact might even be broader,
Right.
and um, yeah, I think one of our biggest challenges is that, as you're saying, is that we sort of awaken from the stupor, the of the status quo, the way that things have been sort of served up to us, and sometimes,
Right.
There's a common tendency, I think, in our day and age. I'm not sure how old you are now. I'm assuming probably around the same age as me.
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
but I would say that, like folks who grew up in our time period, being a teenager, that was actually prolonged a little bit. It wasn't,
Sure.
when you're 21 or 22, like my dad, he got married at 18 or 19, something like that. Right. I didn't get married until I was 37. Right.
Gotcha.
And
I'm
so,
37 now, so yeah.
oh, okay.
Cool.
There it is. Yeah. So, and that being said, we go through, our working life a bit longer, almost being somewhat infantilized just by virtue of the kind of system that we live in, like the way that, this protracted youth is kind of advertised to us, the be single and mingle, attitude in our 20s. And I'm not saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing, but sometimes it sort of staves off or preempts certain kinds of realizations, that we have as we as some of us might have as we get older. I mean, this might not be a universal, but like I think one of the things that's important about what you said is, sometimes we have this, wake up call a little bit later in life, right? And maybe, I mean, at least in my case, I felt a little bit of regret about not leaning into some of those previous experiences of the radical wake up calls. Right?
Yeah, man. Yeah. I mean, I used to think that like that. Oh, it's, I blame myself a little bit. 'Cause like, it took something happening to me or someone that I loved in order to, push me in that radical direction that could be willing to, step in and fight for or fight on behalf of someone else not experiencing the same thing. Like that it took that personal aspect of it to push me in that direction. I thought that I had a bit of regret, or I always did feel like that was part of a big regret, one of my bigger regrets. But I would say that over the course of time since that point, I've kind of learned that like maybe the best point, like the best, you can't just have a conversation with somebody and expect them to radicalize immediately through that conversation. And also oftentimes there's not a space for that conversation to happen. But maybe the best space to radicalize someone would be like, like in the back of a paddy wagon with them as you're being rounded up. Like, hey, cops suck. All cops are bastards, right? But that's not going to happen to you every day, So maybe what is required in order to push people in the direction of radical thought and politics and organizing is, unfortunately, something personal happening to them. And I think it was something like Mao told his nephew, like, when you grow up, I'd be happy if you were a liberal or something. And he's like, why would you say that? And he's like, well, you've never suffered, so how can you be a communist, kind of thing.
Interesting.
So yeah, well, man, tell me.
Well, one thing that I would say is that, just to kind of bring the conversation full circle to a material spirituality, and on the topic of radicalizing, I think one of the most radical materialist spiritual experiences that we could have is truly living in the present, escaping capitalist time.
Yeah.
Right? Whether that means our work time or the structure of time that's imposed upon us. And, without getting too deep into the details, I am somewhat of a believer in the communism of now, that the intensities that we want to realize under communism are more or less available to us, at least in their incipient, stages. The life and the vitality that will make those changes possible are in the here and now. And then the question is, how do those things get activated? Well, I believe that those forces, that awareness, the kind of conversation that we're having right now, the relationships that you build, they become, little nodes, or they become little assemblages, synergies, right?
Yeah.
And then with the right catalyst, there are things that you can do from time to time. You can break out of the system. I mean, you only have to look at, for example, I was recently going down the YouTube rabbit hole of riots that took place in Japan when they built the big airport in Narita, the big airport outside of Tokyo. Yeah, there was a sort of rural farming population who had basically fused together with a force and vitality that, like, you rarely see. I mean, you saw it during the Black Lives Matter movement to a certain extent, but I mean, these farmers were organized like the military, practically, with giant telephone poles as jousts against the police, and saying no. And I mean, that airport exists in Japan today, but it came 35 years late. And I think they're still building additions to it now, but it was something that they were able to postpone. And, this once again raises the question, like, here I am as a young man flying into Japan, into that very airport, and it's creating all the experiences now that I'm nostalgic about, right? The membrane of capitalism is covering the earth, and built upon the backs of these failed struggles. But here we are appearing again, and so, one of the sort of questions that remains in my mind is, how do we do this, given the fact that that capitalism as a force has this incessance and strength, that has basically infused its axiom into every aspect of our being. Like, will there ever be an end to it? Right. So some of the accelerationists will say we got to push further. Right.
Sure.
But the question is, is there an end to it? Right. Because maybe the end involves, a destruction of the very conditions of the possibility of our existence, in terms of breathing clean air, drinking clean water,
Right.
Are we going to do ourselves in before that happens? And so, I think our Matt brought it up. He put it very aptly once, saying that the real question of today's politics is it acceleration or communization? Whereas in the past, it might have been something like, is it Marxist-Leninism or is it anarchism, right? I think in some sense, those tendencies sort of map onto these new terms, but with, sort of minor tweaks.
Right.
But, that's the thing. Regardless, I think no matter what, we do live in this present moment. And all of the tools that we have, like the tools that we're using here, are the ones that will be at our disposal if some sort of mass change is possible.
Speaking of tools, man, I was listening to an interview with Vijay Prashad recently, and he had me cracking up, man, because he reminded me, he was like, have you ever seen an agrarian revolt? Because there is a reason why part of the communism symbol is the sickle. Like, part of that is the sickle for a reason, man. An agrarian revolt is a scary thing. And so it's, but it's interesting, man. You talk about the communism of now, and I think that really relates to like the, I don't know, just talking about the temporality of life, and that we're here now, and these are our only moments, and rather than getting discourse like kind of lost in the clouds, or focusing on the next life as this life was just like in preparedness for it or something, the communism of now is I might just title this interview or episode "Communism of Now" with you. That's interesting, man. Because I kind of, because that's really what part of it that propels me forward is understanding how precious our time is, and how. And as a songwriter, as a musician, as a person that's creative, it's also like how precious my own time to think is. And in that, like, if I need time that is undistracted, and I have certain conditions that are not allowing that to happen, whether it's economic anxiety that creeps in, disturbs that process, whether it's thoughts of obligations to make ends meet by, work or what have you. Like, all of this, in a way, kind of infringes creativity to me. There's a certain, and I used to think I was a little bit of like a diva for needing like a couple days of isolation before I can go and, or like, you just can't sit down and write a song right away. Like, part of the process is sitting there and not doing a damn thing and like staring out a window.
Absolutely, yeah.
Time
you feel some guilt about that.
Yeah,
yeah,
I really did, and during the pandemic too, it was like much like you. I came to podcasting during the pandemic, but it was just something about music felt a bit like insufficient to me, man. Like when COVID happened, I went to a very existential place and started questioning like what is truly meaningful, and am I honoring those aspects in my life and the way I just live my life. And so so part of music feeling insufficient was that I felt like, so on the one hand, it felt insufficient, but even if it was sufficient, I felt like, my ways of making my way in the world through music and performance and playing out and running sound for shows and all that stuff had been stripped from me. So for a little while there, I really felt like I had been displaced, like an alien in my own skin. I describe it as like being alienated from myself. And so podcasting really helped me sort of get back in touch with, because I had to do a bit of like, asset inventory. It's like, what do I have? I have microphones and recording equipment and instruments and stuff, and so you maybe reterritorialize your entire mode of engaging an audience that way. And the only reason why I knew to trust in creating a podcast and that there would be an audience that would discover me, or there would be an audience that I would discover rather, is that I already had that faith affirmed through playing music for years and engaging with people in crowds, and just being kind of a person that's very public. And I have a lot of people that I keep up with my shows, an email list and stuff, and it's really wonderful, and it's a community, and it's always sort of been this sort of sense of community, and it's in a fulfilling way. And so ultimately, I just realized that what am I missing out of this pandemic? I'm missing community. And the rub was that every time I came to that realization, it took the long way around philosophically to arrive back at that realization. It was just that, okay, well, you can't have community right now, and so as soon as some sort of normalcy came back into life, I got a job as a sound guy, and I've been doing sound 4 days a week now.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, and it's it's kind of wild, man. It's a small room with a big system, and it's kind of hard not to be loud. But it's a lot of fun doing that at this point. And so I guess I say all that to say that, like, the communism of now, I just told myself I was going to get all the community I could stand. It
Right.
basically is like if there is another lockdown, if there is whatever that happens, I'm going to go into that knowing that I got every little bit of morsel or what have you of community. And so I wonder, man, like, since some normalcy is returned at this point, are you playing out, or are you engaged in any musical projects? What are you doing?
Oh, okay. So, well, for years and years, I played in an original, kind of like an alt metal band.
Cool.
At one point, we had a fairly decent following in LA. We were kind of connected to other acts that were well known. Cut, a couple albums.
Yeah.
And I still, like, one of my best friends is, someone with whom I still play in other bands. And one of the things that we did during the pandemic was he was writing demos. I wasn't doing, like, in the past, I would do some of my own demos, but now it was his turn, right? I mean, he's kind of the musical brain of the band anyway. And then he would just forward them along. I just throw scratch vocals on, toss it back, and it's like, hey, when we can get together, we'll work on this. So we have this sort of modest cache of these little tunes that we will likely develop them very soon. Maybe even as early as this week. He's going to stop by my place. Everybody's vaccinated now, and
Awesome.
So we're gonna do that. One of the things that I've struggled to do musically my whole life was to do something on my own musically.
Sure.
And I, for years, just kind of on the side, it was almost like, if we, coming back to this word repose here, like one of the ways that I would sort of take a break from the energy of the live stage is just make ambient music and, maybe something like a lo-fi hip hop or some avant-garde kind of music as sort of an adjunct to that. And I had always told myself, well, at some point I'm going to perform this stuff live. And I never did. Right. And so,
Right.
But I had this, I had a whole bunch of tracks on my computer. And then, at some point during the pandemic, I was like, I wonder if I have enough tracks to, like, release an album. And it didn't take me, like, any more than a day or two to be like, oh my gosh, there it is. All right, let's put them in a session. Let's get them mastered, and voila, I did it. And
Whoa.
so just put it out. So, and then came the podcast. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to just do my music on the podcast and maybe kind of advertise it, and like, I'll say, if you put your link in a YouTube video, like, somebody will buy your stuff if it's on Bandcamp, so I've had, a very modest amount of sales, but a lot of people now know my music through, like the intro or the interludes that I do. And I think that's a very happy place for, the derivative of that exploit, like that little side project that I had, like, has found its home in the podcast. Now, that said, there were other requests that were made of me. For example, some of the people that I connected with through the pandemic, this crew in Louisiana called Yes We Cannibal, the art space, whom you might be familiar with.
Cool.
I did like a little live stream for them. And then one of the ways that I engage with the listeners of our podcast is Occasionally I did one this past weekend is, I'll set up some gear, some pedals, maybe 1 or 2 synthesizers, get some loops going, and I'll do a little ambient performance while I do an Ask Me Anything, right? And that was a really kind of nice way to do things too. And sometimes I'm not even, answering the questions, but just doing the live set, and people are into it. And so that was a nice venue for that project to manifest. But I could see myself, this year or sometime in the near future, maybe doing like an ambient live set. It's happened. And so in that sense, I'm one of the people who's privileged with not having, suffered during the pandemic, and, having a lot of really great things happen to me actually in the absence of having to work, and, being able to realize that for myself. So, but, I keep in mind that, not everybody has had that privilege. And one of the things that pleases me is to extend that. Like, I give the album away to all of my fans. Like, hey, if you just want it, just DM me. I'll just send it to you for free. Or just listen for free. But at the same time, like maybe you saw, like I did that whole line of t-shirts and stuff for our podcast and everything. And one of the things that I've been able to do is, I've been able to retain my salary. I've made some money doing some of these corporate gigs, like when I do cover bands and things like that. And, so I have things that some other people don't have. And so I use a lot of the money that I make, in these exploits to help people out that I see online, especially like with mutual aid and stuff like that. Because if there's one thing that I wanted, it wasn't so much the money. I just wanted somebody to reach out and say, hey, I can help in this situation. You know what I mean? And so the idea of mutual aid that I have, I wouldn't call myself a mutualist per se, although that's the kind of praxis that I engage in sometimes, is that I want to make the connection and the comradeship. It's not just a donation, Right. It's somebody who's in the network now. They're in the assemblage. And, that person, at the right time might be an important ally in a battle that you fight, or a comrade in a battle that you fight, or whatever. So, I mean, it's the least that I can do with, what we're doing here.
Right.
And fortunately, I don't have millionaire tastes. I'm happy with my modest bedroom setup, my keyboard and my pedals here. And right. I'm not a gear hound either. Like, I tend to have a modest collection of gear. If I have too much, I sell it, So,
are you playing keyboards in these cover bands?
No, I'm the singer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So let me ask you. So that's always like, so are you theatrical in your performances as a front man, or are you?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Well,
because sometimes they don't, man. Sometimes like guys that just sing, they stand there and they're cool, and they, it's funny. Sometimes I think, wearing cargo shorts on stage is appropriate, kind of thing. It's like, so
it just depends on the gig, right? So, I mean, in my case, I kind of hesitate to say, but I play in a couple of musical era acts, an 80s and a 90s act. One of the acts is like kind of famous around the nation.
Sure.
Has different iterations of the band in major cities. Maybe somebody can deduce from what I'm saying for whom I'm playing. But what's nice is, and here's like another crazy story. Just living in LA of music stories. So, the guys that I used to play with, but one day, the bass player, one of my best friends, calls me. He's like, hey, I'm in a pinch. And I hadn't done a gig in a while. Like, it just wasn't what I was focusing on. I'm in grad school and stuff. And he's like, can you learn 14 songs in 3 weeks? There's a gig in San Diego. It's just 80s stuff, Billy Idol, and, Pat Benatar, like all the classics, they're all in there. Just learn them. Right. And then, there'll be one rehearsal, and then we'll go and play. And I was like, I hadn't played in a while. And I was like, I'm like, it's kind of missing in my life. All right, I'll do it. And I knew it was going to be a pain in the ass. Right. So there I'm on lunch breaks with the headphones in, with the lyrics out, just memorizing. Right. And then like 3 days before the gig, he's like, oh man, it got canceled. right? So, and then I was like, what? I have all these songs in my head. So then I just started started spitballing with the bass player. I was like, he's like, hey, did you ever get that 90s band going? And to make a long story short, we kind of came up with the idea in that conversation. Like, he's like, oh, let me go pitch it to the promoter. Well, we pitched this idea to the promoter, and it's out there, and we created a band. And then 2 weeks later, I'm in like, where was I? I was in Aspen, Colorado, playing there, and then doing shows around LA and stuff. And like, it just happened so fast, costumes and everything. Right.
Wow.
And because I was part of that, then I got put into this 80s band too, as a sub. And then eventually I started playing maybe every other weekend in Vegas for a while. And so like this weird musical career just spawned like on my 40th birthday, right? And so anybody who's listening right now, if you're a musician and you're 35 and you haven't made it yet, you can still make it, because my musical career took off when I was 40. And I'm still doing it. And so now that the pandemic is, well, I won't say it's winding down. We're definitely at a kind of dip right now, but I was able to play like one of these like bigger gigs around town, and yeah, it's cool, and others are on the way. Like I'm getting, like I got an email earlier, like, okay, hey, can you do this, and this over the next few days? You have to learn these songs. I'm like, yeah, okay. And so it's kind of coming back. So
sweet.
Yeah, it's really fun. Like, and what I love about it is, I mean, I love playing my own original music, but there really is something. I thought about writing a book about this someday, which is, the things that I learned playing cover music. Because first of all, you become an amazing songwriter because you know what hits. Right. And if you do it well and you're playing with the right musicians and you have big crowds, you're going to see it. This isn't to say that you're going to be an amazing songwriter, but now you have this perspective that not a lot of people get, especially if you're like a front man. You see the crowd bouncing and that sort of thing. So like how, the dynamics, not only of the song, but the way that it's played and so forth, how it hits the crowd. So I really love those experiences. And plus, those are those people's favorite tunes. Anybody who knows, especially if you live in Los Angeles and you write an original song and you have an original band, people aren't going to be cheering their ass off while you're up there. They're going to be judging you, right? It's a tribunal. Dude. It's a tribunal, right? But if you go out and you play, I don't know, if you play Billy Idol, or if you go and you play, any Duran Duran or anything else, you're going to see that it hits people in a certain way. And it's really fun. It's really fun. It's one of the very few sort of, talk about, communal experiences, like that's the one thing that we share as Americans is this music, and so to be able to partake in that festival is something that's unique, and to be the front person in that festival is also a sort of a unique experience.
Yeah, man. The cover band thing, man, I've always, been a guy that writes the stuff and then gets guys around him and then fires a drummer many times over until you find someone that lasts a little bit longer than the last drummer he fired, kind of thing.
Right.
I will say that in conversations with some of my musical friends, one thing they've told me, they've been like, the guys that come from that like cover world, or that's what they do as a primary thing. He's been like, listen, man, you're like fighting uphill, writing your own stuff, getting your own people, making them learn songs that you wrote that, and he's like, if you just do a cover band thing, the girls are dancing and the crowd loves it and people are into it. And, the rehearsals aren't as bad. Just everybody has the same reference listens, and they're great reference listens. There's not some shitty demo you send people or something.
Right.
Like there's all these different things about playing covers as opposed to doing the original thing that kind of facilitate things coming together with a bit less friction than it would otherwise. So I think it's funny how you mentioned how that came together very quickly. And I don't mean to say that it would be, playing the music or learning it or executing it would be in any way an easier thing. It's quite, it's always, when things come together, there's obviously the effort and there's the work and the musicianship and the years of practice, but there's always a wind of like luck, it seems like, when things fall into place just right. That is like not up for you and I to decide, or no one, so but going back to this whole thing, the tribunal thing you mentioned, man, I think that's
Right.
hilarious, dude. Because like, I lived in Nashville for a while, and the thing I learned out there was that like, whether you are playing originals or whether you are playing covers, there's enough people playing on Broadway playing covers, like the best. Like you go to Nashville and like Tuesday afternoon at a burrito place, there's a cover band with horns playing for the rhythms or playing for the tip jar, man. And it's like, you know, and they're all like excellent at what they do.
Absolutely.
So it's a tribunal fucking either way when you step out in that town, which means, you know, when I was there, I was just cutting my teeth as an engineer. I never stepped out to play anywhere because it's a tribunal, man.
Yeah.
You know,
it's scary.
But it took me moving to Woodstock, New York, man, to sort of understand, like, at a certain point, I was like, you know, I've worked on a lot of other people's records, and why did I never work on my own? And so it went from that when we were talking off air about how at one point I had aspired to create my whole album in my bedroom, and it was very ego driven. It was very like, it was something that I wanted to do for me, and to the sacrifice or to the detriment of how that music landed anyway. It was very ego driven, which is not the way one should go about creating music for a lot of different reasons. But the point is that I moved to I moved to Woodstock from Nashville, and it was up here where it was like it was like seemed like a good place to like step out, to cut my teeth, to maybe have a few bad gigs on the way to having things be tighter. And it's Woodstock, New York is like the coolest little music scene that no one really talks about, man.
Oh, interesting.
There's all sorts of all sorts of cool history up here, from like Big Pink, where the band cut music from Big Pink there, with Dylan, and the Basement Tapes were there. And that's like 10 minutes down the road in a house that the guy Airbnbs now, he Airbnbs it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. You know, there's all sorts of pictures of like John Sebastian still lives in town. You know, like it's wild shit like that, where it's like, you know, this place where I work at, it's a restaurant too, and I do sound there 4 nights a week. But like, you know, during the day, like, you know, like somebody texts like Jackson Brown was at the CVS. I'm like, really? What? I'm sorry, not Jackson Brown, Donald Fagen. And and I'm sorry, I don't know why I got those two wires crossed there. That's kind of a weird wire to cross. But yeah, so like, you know, and like John Sebastian hanging out just on like in the patio, having a beer, eating like a sandwich, reading the paper kind of thing. So it's a really cool little scene up in Woodstock, New York. But yeah, man, I mean, it's cool to hear the perspective of like LA and that stuff coming together, and how it's kind of a tribunal in LA, because I've never actually been to LA, and I've done music in Nashville and New York now, but I still never made it to the West Coast. And so I suspect that, like, you know, you said your guy pitched it to a promoter, which is like, you know, maybe that's a different process of going about getting a gig than it would be in this market, you know?
Yeah. Well, in this case, there was already a built-in audience, and he had the connections and everything. I mean,
right.
It's really a who you know sort of scene, and like I said, I kind of stumbled into it.
Right.
My friend, and I mean, it's the sort of thing now, like, if you've been a musician in LA and you're any good, and you've been around and you're working and you're making connections, like sometimes it just takes like making that one friend or playing that one gig as a sub. And next thing you know, like my best friend, he went on tour with Danny Harrison, right, as the bass player. And so he plays for him, and he plays for bass in a lot of other bands that are around him. And then, like Danny Harrison's so for example, like one of Danny Harrison's friends was getting married, and so I got recruited to do like this kind of wedding singer 80s gig for that. And it's like it's a little bit of an incestuous community. I mean, there are little tendrils that go out here and there, and you know, so like you do have your brush with like sort of famous figures and things like that. Like, I mean, there's always those gigs, like we go to play in Vegas, and it's like, oh, Vinnie Paul's in the audience tonight, you know, or the killer, you know, just stuff like that, like is always happening. And, you know, you get to meet and shake hands with those people and stuff. And then every now and again, like one of those things becomes an opportunity, or becomes a relationship anyway, that gets your career moving, you know, and as you know, it's, you know, it's tooth and nail. Like
Yeah,
there are people who are trying hard. And one of the things is just your vibe as a human being,
Sure.
If you don't have the right sort of comportment, you're not going anywhere. It doesn't matter how good you play. And I mean, this was certainly the case with, like I played with this one guitarist, a phenomenal guitarist, loved his playing, terrible attitude.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I hear you, man. You got to be a good hang, I mean, people got to enjoy being around you. And if you can make other people want to be around you and want to work with you, then you'll go far, you know? But yeah, I mean, it's kind of, at this point now, man, doing sound at this place, it's really wonderful that like, it's allowed me to sort of reconnect with a lot of people in my network, a lot of friends that are musicians that, I'm happy to absorb the folks that are really eager to get back out there and play. But I just, before we wrap this up, I want to say that, the D&G Quarantine Collective thing, man, was maybe, it actually really helped me in understanding like some D&Gs, some Deleuze and Anti-Oedipus and stuff like that. Like it was so helpful. And I used to listen to that stuff, going to sleep, and it was always like really funny to me because I had just discovered what Discord was. So I imagined like as the episodes go on, there would be more people attending these discussions. Sure. And you would say things like, oh, we'll unmute anybody or something, come on and talk to us, And so between like the sort of, the different voices that would speak up, with different questions, or even when nobody asked a question and there was just a space and it was like, okay, we'll go on from there, like,
okay.
Like it's actually a really wonderful thing. And I thought of, and I thought of how in its way, it kind of, to me anyway, I thought it was an amazing idea that someone had thought to host a podcast, or not host a podcast, but host a discourse that was turned into a podcast through Discord. Because I don't know that I had heard of many people going about things in that way. And I thought it was one of the most creative uses of Discord that I'd encountered. And so there was this whole, just in the way that kind of, capitalism and schizophrenia is sort of a manifesto for creativity. I thought Deleuze might have been proud that you had sort of reterritorialized the intention of that platform and its uses to sort of come out with something that was anti-capitalist and creative and just really beautiful what you guys did.
Yeah, I think there's, it seems to me that the connection between, like you said, the platform and the content and the time and history, that there was a sort of unique nexus there. Yes. And, maybe bringing the conversation full circle here, what it said to me was, amidst the sort of regular pacing of our lives, whatever that was prior to the pandemic, there was a demand for something different. And it coalesced in the form of this reading group and the podcasts and the many podcasts. I mean, like, we are not the only ones. Like, there are other people now doing other things that are building off of what we had done. And also taking time to appreciate theory on its own terms. Like, I mean, often folks get hit with the charge like, oh, what you're reading isn't radical, right? But, it reminds me of Raya Dunskaya and what she had said at one point. Like, there was a point in the midst of the revolution where she said, now is the time to just stop and think. And Zizek has this similar idea too, right? Don't act, think, right? I mean, I didn't quite get the quote right, but the essence of it is, it comes back to repose. Like, the text itself, is something that's pleasurable. The time that you spend with it, I think of the kind of Confucian ethic of meditation, reading as a kind of meditation, and the sort of collective reading that we engaged in on that platform. Nobody had done that in history prior to. I'm sure of it, at least with that material, in the way that we did it, in the way that we sort of put it out there, right? I mean, and there is almost like a sort of celebrity rock star thing that happened for a few weeks there as this thing was emerging, right? Because there was an interest, there was an energy, and as I mentioned, there was time. Time was given back to us. You know, it wasn't under the best circumstances, but we were able to experience ourselves in a way that was different, and I would venture to say radical. And so with that, you know, we continued the tradition through Acid Horizon.